What if Rome didn't just worship gods? What if it managed them like a living roster? In the next few minutes, we'll track how a city of farmers built a global empire by updating its pantheon, from the native Dii Consentes to the newly invited Dii Consentes. Think of it like a software patch for the soul. When crises hit, Rome added a deity, a rite, a festival. Stay with this, because by the time we reach the Imperial Cult, you'll see how a calendar could govern an army, and why faith became Rome's most flexible tool. Why would a city treat its gods like layers you can peel and add, instead of a fixed family in the sky? Rome answers with a system that grows by design. Think of it as a living onion. At the center sits a small, sturdy core. Around it, rings that form when the city meets new neighbors, new wars, new needs. Each ring stays. None fully replaces the last. That's the point. At the core, you have old, local powers tied to land, hearth, oath, and gate. They speak to fields and walls, the things you can touch and count. On top of that, a Greek layer settles in. Familiar names, polished tales, statues that look like they stepped out of a theater. Then another layer, drawn from foreign cults and distant cities, arrives with drums, processions, and precise rites. Rome does not melt these down, Rome shelves them. It labels them. It works them like tools. Most of us learn to list the Greek 12 as if the heavens had a fixed cabinet, but Rome refuses a final roster. Why keep it open? Because a city that grows needs coverage. New problems call for new expertise. Gods become specialists, and specialists need desks, duties, and dates on the calendar. Stability comes from process, not from freezing the lineup. So we get a contrast in how a pantheon breathes Greek myth, leans on a steady constellation of Olympians with story as the glue. Rome partitions divine life into categories. One set is indigetes, the original powers woven into the soil and civic bones. Another set is novencides, the newcomers who arrive with a vow, a statue, and a rule book. That split tells us how Rome thinks. Origin grants authority. Admission requires paperwork. What this means is that stories matter, but offices matter more. A god holds an office the way a magistrate holds a post. The role has duties, festivals, and legal edges. Rights define what must be said, when, and by whom. If you perform the right wrong, you do it again, because correctness keeps the city safe. Myth explains why a god has a nature. Ritual explains how that nature ties into law and time. Imagine this as a civic constitution that accepts amendments. The core articles govern oaths, borders, fires, and harvests. When the city meets a new threat or opportunity, it drafts an amendment. The amendment names a power, sets a feast day, specifies a temple, and lists the words you say when you ask for help. Once passed, it sits beside the old rules. Nothing erases the earlier clauses. They stack. This is where the priestly calendar becomes the spine. Those days, marked and classified, anchor civic time. Work pauses or proceeds based on what line of the calendar you wake into. Rites unfold in sequence, linked to offices and courts. When people say Rome lived by ritual, they mean the city kept time with bells of sacrifice and processions that set the pace of politics. Fasti and festival lists are like the city's operating schedule, telling you when you can plead a case, close a deal, or call the people to a vote. On the other hand, the calendar does more than schedule. It integrates newcomers. A foreign god does not drift in by rumor. A rival takes a vow, a senate decision, a priest who knows how to speak the formal words. The new deity gets a spot on the board, a festival date, and a financial stream to keep the rite running. The city converts a strange power into a familiar task that is not fashion. that is policy. Across cultures, gods often weave into myth like family trees. Rome instead treats them like portfolios. One god guards hinges and entries. Another signs off on boundaries. One presides over a sacred flame tied to the health of the city. Others take command of fields, markets, or public safety. Additions do not threaten the old posts. They fill gaps. They clarify. The roster grows because the city's work grows. This is why the names we hear from Greek tradition fit differently in Rome. They inherit faces and tails, but they clock into Roman jobs. A familiar sky power becomes the anchor for legal oath. A goddess of marriage turns into law for households and the bond that makes a city. A war god takes charge of season and muster, not just battle heat. The frame stays civic. The functions plug straight into how people live and how the state runs. If you listen for it, you can hear a pattern of recruitment. Law calls a god. A treaty welcomes a power with honors. A special rite asks a rival city's guardian to accept better treatment and a new home. The key is invitation through form. Rome insists that gods, like people, deserve due process. Ritual creates that process. And once a god agrees, the city assigns a ritual team, funds a temple, and adds the date to the clock that keeps Rome turning. That is the onion. Core locals, Greek overlays, and foreign rings, all kept in place by offices and calendars. It sounds loose until you notice how strict the system is about words, days, and roles. Even mistakes have procedures. If an ill-omened sign appears, someone knows which file to pull and what correction fits. A priest recites, a sacrifice cleans, a city exhales. What this shows is a deliberate design. Rome did not stumble through pantheon changes. It engineered them. The aim was coverage, every risk with a remedy, every act with a rite, every god with a seat and a schedule. A flexible roster with a firm rulebook change as a way to stay stable. So when we ask why Rome's gods change, the answer lands neat and clear. The city optimized. It added strength where it found weakness and held fast to what kept order. The layers are not drift. They are policy. The pantheon grows like streets grow, planned and paved with signs that tell you where you stand. Now that we see the layers, let's meet the core that Rome swore by first. We'll step into the early fields and hearths, where duty smells like smoke and fresh earth, and a city learns to keep faith by keeping its tools in working order. What did Rome worship before marble temples and empire, when it was just fields and fences? Start small, a hearth that must not go out. A boundary stone that marks where one duty ends and another begins. A furrow laid straight. In the old stories, sacred things live where work happens. You bless what you use. You keep order so the land keeps you. Early Italic religion grows from tasks. Sowing asks for a clear season and a clean rite. Harvest requires thanks, given in the right words. A fence line needs protection, not as a boast, but as a promise that you respect your neighbor and your own plot. You can feel how plain this is. No marble, no gilded throne. A clay cup, a steady hand. The sense that the gods stand nearest when the work is careful. You might expect glitter and high drama, but the first layer prefers function over spectacle. The myth is there, soft behind the act. Yet the spotlight sits on the act itself. If a door keeps out cold and strangers, you teach your children to touch the threshold with care. If a fire boils water and bakes bread, you guard the coal like a living thing. The gods of this world do not thrive on applause. They thrive on maintenance, so we step into the house. In the corner, a small shrine holds the Lares, the guardians bound to place and kin. Nearby, the Penates keep the pantry safe, a quiet faith that stores must hold through lean days. You greet them with simple offerings and clean hands. You honor them by running the home well. The point is not theater, it is continuity. You wake, you serve, you close the day with a small rite that says, "We kept faith." At the thresholds, small powers stand watch. A hinge works, a latch clicks, and the passage stays sound. To us, a hinge is only hardware. To them, a hinge is promise. If the moving parts hold, the house stays whole. What this means is that naming a force lets you speak to it, and speaking to it binds you to a standard. You don't pray for luck. You pray for a thing to do its job. At the city's heart burns Vesta's flame. It marks the life of the whole community. When that fire stays bright, the story says the city stays alive. The Vestal guardians keep it. They tend without pause, not as a show, but as a trust. See how the idea fits the age. A steady fire is water hot, food cooked, and signal lit. Vesta's hearth scales the home into the body of the city, so care for one becomes care for all overhead. Jupiter takes a different seat, not a tail-spinning sky king, but an oath keeper. Words sworn in his name become binding cords. Break them, and you cut at the ropes that hold people together. In this frame, the sky god guards speech and promise. Law needs that. Markets need that. A society built on bargains requires a watcher who hates false deals. Mars stands with the fields before he strides with the legions. He is the surge of spring and the call to muster, the power that pushes seed into soil and men into ranks. The link is not odd in this world. The same order that keeps furrows straight shapes a line of shields. Discipline makes grain grow and keeps a border safe. You call on him for crops and for defense because both need strength harnessed to rhythm. Then there is Janus. He minds gates and doors and the start of things. Two faces, one looking back, one forward, not for spectacle, but for a craft of timing. Begin right, end right. Open well, close well. When you step out, when you make a pact, when you declare a season, you pass through him. He is less a character than a hinge for time. The year needs a door. The rite needs a clear first word. The year itself holds fixed stations. Days marked for sowing, for harvest, for oaths, for rest. Some days you work, some days you stand down. Civic duty clicks into that rhythm. Courts open on one kind of day. Votes call on another. Festivals do more than cheer. They pace life so the city and the farm breathe together. You track the moon, the sun, the tasks, and you align your acts with that map. The calendar is not a list, it is a tool. Across this early world, ritual outruns story. A rite says what, when, and how. If you stumble, you repeat it. Correctness matters because a slip can be read as a crack in the bond between people and powers that can sound severe, but it is simply the logic of upkeep. Oil the hinge, sweep the hearth, speak the words clean. The gods are partners who keep their side when you keep yours. Think of worship as maintenance. You tend the flame so the home endures. You mark the lines so peace holds. You time the plow so the soil responds. In that sense, religion is a daily craft. The sacred hides in normal acts done right. You do not need a grand stage for that. You need habit, care, and a sense that work speaks to someone beyond you. This is why these original gods feel different from the famous Greek cast. The Greek tales dazzle with character and plot. Here, the divine wears a toolkit, a boundary stone that must not move, a gate that governs entry, a vow that binds two hands. These are not props to the story. They are the story the myth comes after, to explain or teach. The rite stands first, because the right keeps the world aligned. What this shows is a people who treat faith like craftwork. The city does not yet shout of empire. It whispers instructions. Keep the fire, mind the gate, honor the stone. If that sounds plain, that plainness is the point. Stability needs tasks you can teach and repeat. Sacred time loops through the year to reset the house and the field. Over time, more ornament will come, statues will rise, tales will swell. But before the stage, there was the bench. Before the hero, the hearth. When we start here, the whole later story makes sense. The ground rules were set by tools, habits, and care. And yet, stories are on the road already. They carry exile and promise. They bring heroes whose duty beats like a drum Trojans, and poets walk toward these fields, ready to graft their tale onto this working faith. How did a Greek war become Rome's origin story? We move from fields and hearths to a voyage that begins in smoke. A city burns, a family breaks, and one survivor carries a small box of gods. The path runs from ruin to a new shore, and that path becomes a charter. In the old stories, Aeneas escapes the wreck of Troy and reaches Latium. The route bends through storms and hard choices. He holds to duty when ease would tempt him off course. The tale binds Rome to a chain that starts before Italy. It claims a parent in Venus, not for glamour, but to give the line a legal guardian in the sky. Think of it as a seal stamped on a document. The seal says, "This new city grows under watch." Why claim descent from a defeated side? Because the myth turns loss into license. The Trojan War ends in collapse, but Rome's thread starts there. As if fate held a reserve plan, Trojan loser becomes Roman founder, not by erasing defeat, but by making it a trial that earns future rule. That twist shifts shame into merit. It also lets Rome say, our story links to the famous cycle, yet our charge runs past it. Aeneas stands as a model of pietas. Not soft piety, but a binding set of duties. He serves gods, keeps faith with kin, and moves toward a city not yet built. We see him carry a father, guide a son, and guard the household tokens. Each act stacks into a role that Rome wants to teach. The good leader minds ancestors, offspring, and the unseen powers that expect clean rights. He does not chase glory. He keeps the covenant. In this frame, heroism means endurance under orders you do not write. What this means is that the journey is also a course in civic ethics. We watch alliances form with care, not conquest. Marriages knit tribes. Oaths frame borders. Altars rise where agreements hold. The story turns personal choices into public templates. If a pact works in the tale, it can work in life. If a temple keeps a vow alive on the page, a real temple can do the same in the city. The myth lays out blueprints you can build from stone and law. Imagine this as a relay. Greek legend hands a baton to Latin soil. The runner is a refugee who refuses to drop the rights he carries. Each stop trains him and tests him. When he lands in Latium, he speaks the language of vows. He does not found a city by whim. He courts allies, weighs omens, and folds strangers into kin. The right of welcome and the right of war sit side by side, both regulated by signs and words. You can hear the Roman mind forming in that rhythm. Across the poem that frames this voyage, destiny reads like public policy in verse. A city is promised, not as a gift, but as the end of a duty line. The goal is not a throne for one man. It is a platform for a people who will keep terms with gods and neighbors. The story keeps telling us that success comes when you respect time, accept delays, and act within rules the world recognizes. That tone suits a culture that makes obedience to right a civic skill. Now, the choice to make this myth a state narrative matters. When later audiences hear it, they hear the city's own voice. The poem builds a case that Rome's rise fits the scale of the cosmos, not random luck, not simple might, a scheduled outcome, signed off by higher order. You can feel how that supports law, war, and diplomacy. If destiny approves, then expansion can be framed as duty fulfilled, not greed. It gives officials a script that sounds like fate when they write policy. We also get a flood of etiologies, stories that say how things began. A political tie becomes a marriage in the tale. A border marker becomes the site of a vow. A holy place earns a rite because a key meeting took place there. This pattern turns myth into a catalog of use cases. Need a reason for a procession? The story has one, need a rule for who speaks first. The story assigns it. By mapping rituals to plot points, the myth offers tools for civic life. On the other hand, the arc stays hard. Blood still seals changes. People still fall. The hero accepts that cost. The ethic here is sober. You do what the gods require, and you accept the price. Rome takes that tone and welds it to its own start. Founding will draw lines that hurt. Order will arrive through labor and loss. We are being trained to see law as a line scratched on ground that once ran with fear. What this shows is a method of adopting foreign glory and making it serve local needs. The Greeks hold the grand stage of war, and wily King's Rome borrows a survivor and writes him as a builder. The ancient glamour stays, but the focus tilts to duty and structure. If you love myths, the twist is quiet and firm. A tragic past becomes a warrant. A shipwreck becomes a launch. The appeal of this lineage also lies in shared kin with gods. Venus gives Rome a divine relative who speaks to grace and favor, but the stance remains Roman. Favor demands work. Beauty must be managed. The line does not preen. It files forms, reads omens, and keeps schedules. The lightness of charm meets the weight of law. As the story nears Italy, we start to feel the next beat press in. A city does not rise from right alone. It needs borders set and tested. It needs a founder who can draw a furrow and defend it. The ethic of Aeneas flows into the hands of new figures, born of the land, raised by risk, and ready to stage the first set of rules on raw ground. So the Trojan myth becomes Rome's not by claiming a win that never happened, but by reframing defeat as mandate. Fate moves forward. Duty holds the path. The image that lingers is a man carrying his past while walking toward a place that will outlast him. That motto fits a state that will ask citizens to do the same. From exile to walls, the baton passes again. Twins enter, the augur lifts his staff, and a straight line on earth sets the law that people will kill to keep. What does it cost to draw the first line of a city? The price arrives the moment you put edge to earth. A groove in soil becomes a rule. A rule needs a keeper. And the first test of that rule is not a foreign army, but the person who stands closest to you. In the old stories, the twins come out of the wild to mark a start. They bring the strength of a hillside den and the cunning that rough land teaches. But the founding is not a sprint. It slows for omens. Birds wheel, staffs rise. Eyes lift to measure what the sky allows. You can hear the quiet before the cut, when everyone waits for a sign that gives shape to the field, and the future augury speaks first. The count of wings and the place they fly sets order above opinion. Then the plow bites. A furrow runs like a thread pulled through cloth. It tells you what stays out. It tells you what belongs. The line does not only fence land, it invents a law. Once drawn, the ground changes, and so do the people who live by that groove. Rivalry snaps at that edge. Two brothers, one boundary. Pride pushes where it should pause. The tale says a leap over the sacred trench breaks more than dirt. It breaks the rule that keeps blood from spilling inside. Here, a city learns its first harsh lesson. The law is not a story cue. Cross it, and the world answers. What this means is that Rome ties its life to signs and procedure from the first act. A city that starts with augury must keep listening. A city that guards a trench must grow courts and customs to shield it. The myth compresses that logic into one sharp scene. Honor the line, or pay. The price hangs in the air like cold iron. After the shock, the builder gets to work. Institutions rise fast because the city needs bones. A council of elders forms, so a single hand does not hold all say. A militia stands so border and street both stay safe. Temples anchor the plan, so each district knows which rights keep its clock. These are not props. They shape how people gather, trade, and speak to power. Religion folds into law without fuss. The same place you vote can sit beside the place you sacrifice. The same calendar that sets campaign season sets feast days that blend matters. It means dispute and devotion share a schedule. It means the city can move as one body because the rules of prayer and the rules of court speak in the same tone. Now the specialists step in. Augurs keep the code for reading the sky. They watch, they mark, they declare whether a meeting can begin. Pontiffs hold the playbook for rights. They log what is due, who must serve, and how to repair errors. If a word slips or a step goes wrong, they call a do-over, not from whim, but from a charter that keeps the pact with the gods exact. Think of it like a workshop with two foremen. One checks the blueprint before you cut. The other checks the weld after you join. Together, they prevent stress from pulling the frame apart. This is how a myth about brothers turns into a daily craft of governance. Checks, signs, and sanction fixes keep the city from wandering off its own rules. The wolf and the plow sit as paired emblems in this tale. The wolf signals the wild power that raised the twins. It stands for alertness, quick strike, and shared hunger. The plow speaks of slow strength, measured rows, and care for ground. Rome claims both. It will fight hard, but it will also plant straight. Its armies will move like fields in order, and its fields will feed the armies that guard the line. We hear a phrase for the guiding force beneath these acts: custom of the ancestors. It functions as moral ballast. You do what they did because it kept the world stitched. That custom reaches into ritual and politics at once. It says a rite should follow the old words and a law should honor old forms. Novelty exists, but it earns its way in by showing it can carry the weight the old pattern carried. The first murder at the boundary then reads like a warning preserved by custom. Do not play with the line. Do not shift it for pride. The ghost of that breach stays in procedures that slow you down before you decide, read the sky. Ask counsel, repeat the words. The city learns to drag hot will through a cool sieve. You can feel the pastoral and martial strands nodding. A stock pen needs a good gate. A camp needs a clean ditch. The same skills build both. Count, measure, patrol, repair. A people trained by herds and plots can supply scouts and engineers, not only spear carriers. The myth keeps that memory alive, so later, crowds know where their method came from. What this shows is the city turning faith into an office. Not belief as mood, but practice as duty. A person wears the role of augur and makes public time safe to use. Another wears the role of pontiff and keeps the recipe that keeps the deal with the gods intact. The work is visible. The results are plain. Meetings convene. Trials proceed. Harvest rites land on the right day. Weather and wills vary. The protocol holds. If a fault appears, there is a fix. An ill sign halts the vote. A botched phrase resets the rite. No one asks for perfect hearts. They ask for correct form. The logic is simple. Keep the pattern, and the city gets to try again tomorrow. Break it, and you invite cracks that spread from altar to market to wall. So we loop back to the first cut in the ground. The cost of drawing that line is an ongoing bill. You pay by training people to guard it with habits that last. You pay by punishing those who treat it as a dare. You pay by funding temples and schools of rite so the next voices know the words. This is not glamour, it is maintenance at scale. If founding needs law, it also needs someone to manage the gods who sign the law's lease. Who keeps the sky on the docket? Who logs the days when public business must wait? Who knows the fix when an omen interrupts a trial? The city quietly hires a class of people to make sure divine order can be used like any other service, on time, on record, and audited when needed. That's the mini payoff hiding in the myth. Religion becomes a department. Priests hold portfolios. Rites run on schedules. Faith enters the civic toolkit and stays there, checked and maintained like streets and stores. The personal sense of awe never leaves, but the city wraps it in forms that can outlive any one life. Now we can step into the offices that make that possible, where titles sound like jobs and the calendar reads like a rule book. Meet the officials who keep the cosmic paperwork in order. What if public priests ran like cabinet ministries? In Rome, they did. Offices held the cities packed with the gods, the way other offices held the treasury or the courts. Titles came with rules, uniforms of duty, and a chain of command. You could tour the state by visiting the people who manage sacrifice, omens, and sacred fire, the way clerks manage records. Start with the Pontiffs. Think of them as the keepers of the rule book. They tracked what to do, when, and how, and they kept the archive of rites so memory would not fail the city. When a rite needed repair, they knew the clause to cite and the steps to repeat. Their power came from procedure, not passion. They made sure faith could be used reliably, like public water. Alongside them, the augurs watched for signs. Before assemblies met, before offices took action, this college read the sky and the ground for the city's yes or no. If the signs opposed, business stopped. Not as superstition, but as law. The act had no standing if the omen barred the door. You can hear the rhythm. Pause, consult, proceed. At the center of the city's life, the Vestals guarded a flame that served as the pulse of Rome. That fire was both symbol and service. It promised continuity. It said the city was alive and under care. Their duty was constant, their conduct strict, because the whole city's fate was mapped onto that steady light. The message was simple: we endure. Then there were the Flaminates, priests tied to specific gods with strict dress and ritual habits. Some held major posts, others served lesser but steady cults. Each came with a docket of days and acts. They marked the calendar with their obligations so that no god with a seat in Rome went unattended. The structure created a grid where divine attention aligned with civic time. Here is the tension that surprises modern ears. Personal belief took a back seat to correct performance. A warm heart did not fix a botched formula. An error could endanger public business. If a misstep occurred, you did not argue about intent. You reset, you expiated, you ran the right again, clean. The system valued discipline because the city's safety was staked on form. Ritual law handled the fix. If a sacrificial sign looked off, there was a known remedy. If a word slipped, the record told you how to cure it. Expiation was not a mystery, it was listed. You can feel the craft here. The point was repeatable results. Creed stayed quiet. Procedure spoke out loud. Within that map, certain cults held official standing. Major posts had distinct hierarchies, with senior flamen roles set apart from junior ones. The division mattered because it assigned weight, funds, and attention. The city made sure the big levers of oath, hearth, and order stayed manned with the most guarded offices, while a ring of smaller posts covered the finer gears of civic life. A roster like this meant no season or sector went without care. The calendar tied it all together. Festivals, fasti, and legal days formed a single clock. Some days allowed public business. Others blocked it for rites. Meetings met the sky's schedule through the augurs, and the priest's books guided the flow of offerings and processions. You woke into a day with a setting already loaded. That setting told you what could be done, what must be done, and what must wait. You can think of the calendar as the operating system, with festivals as apps that launch on set dates. Each app opened a path of acts, chants, and closures. When it finished, the city returned to default until the next program loaded. That image explains how private and public life stayed in sync. The same holidays that tied families to altars also guided courts and votes. Time itself was the hinge. When odd signs struck, storms out of season, strange births, lights in the sky, the city did not freeze. Prodigies triggered process. Reports flowed to officials. The Senate directed rights to mend the bond. This is important. Omen did not mean panic. Omen meant paperwork. The fix was ritual, not rumor. What this shows is a state that built a safety net out of rights. If a flaw showed up in the weave, hands knew where to grip and pull to tighten it. A priest did not invent the cure on the spot. The cure lived in the playbook. That gave Rome a way to hold together even when fear rose. Procedure beats dread. Now, if policy can fix ritual errors, can policy also acquire new gods? The logic points that way. The same state that pauses an assembly for a barred omen can also write a vow to a foreign power, offer honors, and formalize a welcome. The tools already sit on the shelf: vows, calendars, funds, and assigned staff. The act is administrative as much as holy. This turns expansion into integration. A conquered city's guardian can be invited into Rome's order with a promise of better care and a permanent seat. The right matters most. Do it right, and the transfer stands in law as well as legend. The point is not theft as sneer. It is lawful hospitality as strategy. Here is the mini payoff. By right, Rome could invite a rival's god to switch sides. Legal frames wrapped spiritual acts. Words and days did the work. The city's officials held the pen. The calendar carried the signature, and the temple sealed the deal. That practice is both pious and tactical. It treats divine relations as diplomacy under rules everyone recognizes. We end with a door half open. If priests can stop a vote, cure a fault, and add a feast, they can also draft terms that pull a power across a border. You can sense where this is going. The next move is a public vow spoken before walls, an offer of honors, and a promise of a home in Rome that no enemy can match. Let's watch Rome write a divine treaty in wartime. Can you siege a city by calling its god to defect? Rome tried, and it wrote the method down. The move has a name: evocatio. It sounds like a whisper over walls, but it runs like a contract. You stand within earshot, you speak a formal vow, and you promise the rival's deity a better home, richer honors, and a safe, steady place in Rome. Think of evocatio as lawful hospitality at the edge of war. The general makes a vow as if he were hosting a guest of high rank. The offer is clear: accept worship with exact rites, receive a temple on Roman soil, and enjoy festivals that will never lapse. The form matters. Without the right words, the door stays shut. With them, the city claims it has given fair terms. At first glance, it feels like theft with incense. But the framing is careful. Rome says it does not steal, it invites. Gods deserve honor that matches their dignity. If a city fails to maintain correct rites, a new city can step in and pledge better service. In that logic, moving is not betrayal, it is proper care. The rite wraps conquest in courtesy. Why would a god respond? In the old stories, deities lean toward stable temples, full altars, and clean, regular speech. Rome can guarantee all three. Its priests know how to keep time and form. Its Senate can assign funds and dates. Its artisans can raise a house that suits divine rank. A god who crosses over receives more than praise. The god receives a system. What this means is that evocatio turns spiritual relation into public policy. The vow says, "We will give you a place, a team, and a calendar slot." It does not rely on a general's charm. It relies on an institution's capacity. The promise includes material support and administrative precision, both designed to make service smooth and unbroken. Descriptions of evocatio place a vow before victory, and a dedication after a triumph may follow, and with it, a new shrine on Roman ground. The sequence teaches a pattern: invitation, success claimed as proof, and permanent housing for the invited power. The state thus binds war, worship, and urban growth into one chain. You hear the cadence: ask, win, install. Now look at the ground effect. If defenders fear their patron may accept better terms, morale bends. If they think their god has already signed, panic can flicker through the ranks. Even if they stand firm, the ritual gives Rome a moral script to justify the fall. The deity chose an order that can sustain the right. In that story, the victor looks like a dutiful host, not a plunderer. After the storm, the city follows through. A new temple goes up. A priest receives a brief. A festival joins the calendar. The god becomes a novenside, a newcomer folded into the working list. With status set and days assigned, citizens learn the name, watch the procession, and add offerings to their rounds. The strange turns familiar without strain because the framework was ready. This practice also quiets the edges of empire. People from a conquered place can find their god alive and well in Rome, not erased, but honored with precision that softens resistance. It gives migrants a point of contact and an identity that the capital recognizes. A rite can do what edicts alone cannot: let people feel continuity inside change. You can think of evocatio like a merger clause in a treaty. A power moves under new management, keeps its core function, and gains resources to perform better. The culture shock fades because the service level goes up. Rites are clean, processions are set, priests show up on time. For a city built on maintenance, this is persuasive theology. Across campaigns, the pattern repeats. A vow spoken at the walls, a victory marked by dedication, a calendar entry minted, and the god seated as a colleague in the civic order. The label novenside signals both novelty and acceptance. They are new, but not outsiders. They have a seat, a day, and a budget line. Integration starts with an oath and ends with a schedule. The system even carries a subtle dignity for the defeated. Instead of treating their sacred life as spoil, Rome treats it as a trust that the previous host could no longer sustain. The cure is not mockery. The cure is better, upkeep. That tone made space for cooperation, especially among local elites who could now serve in roles tied to their own deities, only relocated. What this shows is Rome's habit of turning the numinous into a civic tool without draining its awe. Evocatio does not deny power, it channels it. The rite holds to a simple thesis: gods prefer stable care. If Rome can prove it will provide that care, then honoring transfer looks orderly, even righteous. You might ask, did this always happen at walls under fire? The image is strong, but the deeper truth is the same, whether in siege or in peacetime adoption. Formal vows, public dedications, and calendared festivals mark entry. A god accepted into the city receives the same dignity as older cults, plus the publicity of a new procession that teaches citizens how to take part. When a god enters by evocatio, the city gains more than a patron. It gains a shared script for mixed communities. Soldiers, traders, and migrants can rally around a ritual track they recognize that fosters trust. Markets open, alliances hold. The sacred and the social reinforce each other with each repeated act. There is also a military edge. A general who can promise divine favor through legal vows adds leverage without swinging a sword. He can claim that victory aligns with cosmic order, and then he can seal that claim with brick and bronze back home. The temple stands as proof that the deal was kept on both sides, by the city and, in the story, by the god. On the other hand, some powers loom larger than local walls. What happens when the deity is massive, with rites that span seas and carry deep private meaning for devotees? The method still works, but the scale shifts. The welcome must fit the weight. Honors must expand to match the reach and appeal of the cult. That question leads us to famous arrivals, where the state negotiates not just with a city's guardian, but with a god whose music, mysteries, and festivals can fill streets. You can feel the system strain and adapt. The calendar stretches. New offices may form. Processions grow in size and sound. Here's the mini payoff. Absorb or ally, Rome preferred both. Evocatio turned rivals into house guests with contracts. The city gained protection, prestige, and a script for unity. The gods gained constant service and prime real estate in a capital that never sleeps. Now the doors open wider. The East arrives with drums, sistra, and secret halls, and the Roman clock makes room for their beats. What do you do when your soldiers bring home mysteries? You open a space in the schedule, you build a doorway, and you ask how these rites fit the city's way of keeping time. Rome faced that question as Eastern cults crossed with troops and traders, carrying drums, sacred signs, and a promise of close-knit bonds that the old public rites did not try to give. The Great Mother, Isis, and later Mithras arrive with different flavors of belonging. One thunders with processions, and a powerful mother, motif 1, moves with water, healing, and the poise of a goddess who spans lands. One travels in small circles underground, lit by lamps, bound by rank, and shared meals. Each offers intensity. Each offers a way to belong when you stand far from home. Now the tension shows. State religion likes daylight. It likes clear words, open altars, and rites you can watch from the curb. Mystery cults lean private. They speak in stages, reserve their deeper acts, and stir the heart with personal vows. Public Rome sets rules that anyone can learn. These newcomers promise a path that feels like a secret earned. What this means is that Rome must decide how far to stretch without tearing. The answer, as usual, is administrative. Tolerate, regulate, and when the lines blur, restrain. You see the blend in how the city permits temples for certain cults, sets limits on who serves where, and still lets festivals spill into streets where all can watch. The balance keeps order while letting meaning travel. Think of it like water meeting a canal. The flow is new, but the channel shapes it. When a cult arrives by vow, decree, or patronage, it gets a house, a schedule, and rules that match the city's constitution of rights. Evocatio can frame the welcome. A senatorial act can assign funds or boundaries. An emperor's nod can lift a feast to full civic glare. The forms matter more than the mood. For many, the appeal is practical. Soldiers posted far away find a circle that feeds them stories of courage, sacrifice, and reward beyond the camp's churn. Traders meet in courtyards where a shared hymn also means a trusted handshake. Migrants hear a familiar name in a strange town and step into a room that smells like home. Portable rites become social glue that travels in a kit you can carry. Across the city, processions work as public translators. The Great Mother's train drums through the streets and normalizes her presence with noise and rhythm. You cannot ignore rites for Isis move with ordered steps and flowing dress, turning a foreign name into a date on the city's mind. Even cults that prefer inner rooms still touch the calendar when initiates mark shared meals, rank, and renewal at steady intervals. Public time wraps private trust. On the other hand, the state keeps a hand on the dial. If a private rite starts to pull crowds away from civic obligations, rules tighten. If a festival strains the peace, limits appear. This is not panic. It is maintenance. Rome treats cults as services that must fit the grid can stretch, but it must hold. For devotees, the draw includes rescue from the blur of empire. In a capital where faces change by the hour, a small group that knows your name is a lifeline. Rites give scripts for grief, hope, and moral restart. When a man returns from a hard border, or a woman loses kin to fever, these cults offer words that feel tailored, not just civic. You can hear the quiet in that room and the relief when the chant lands. The city also sees value. Well-run cults lower strain. They give migrants a circle inside the whole. They set codes that keep people sober, loyal, and under watch. A governor can stand in public ceremonies and then trust that private vows will not undermine law because they fit the existing calendar and report to recognized priests. Integration becomes a shared habit rather than a fight. Festivals act as bridges. A procession that moves past familiar altars teaches the crowd that this god now belongs to Rome's map. The beat syncs with the city's pace. Children point, merchants pause, and officials show up in proper dress. After a few cycles, the sight is normal. Names that once sounded far now live on everyone's tongue, attached to streets and steps you can visit. You can see a pattern. Foreign powers enter through clear doors, a vow during crisis, a decree when peace demands order, or imperial interest that turns a cult into a symbol of unity. Once inside, the city assigns days, routes, and funds. Temples go up on sites that fit traffic, and meaning the novelty settles into routine. Awe settles into service. Now the deeper question rises. If gods can be imported, can the city also mint new ones for its own needs? The precedent points yes. A people who give ritual posts to far gods can also assign names to functions they must guard. The logic runs straight from a grandmother of mountains to the hinge that must not fail when a door swings. Pause and imagine that scene for a moment. You cross a bridge, and a plaque marks the rites that bless its upkeep. You enter a gate, and the bolt has a name that gets a yearly nod. You walk past a drain, and even that dark channel has a small shrine with fresh leaves. The city treats function like a sacred trust. Nothing that serves all goes unnamed. Here's the mini payoff. Rome uses cults as infrastructure. The same state that can host a goddess with a world's reach can also honor the tiny work that keeps daily life in tune. Deities stand over sewers, hinges, and boundary stones, because those things guard peace as much as soldiers do. Ritual becomes service. Service becomes a moral map. What this shows is a smooth slide from global awe to local care. Grand processions teach the city to absorb difference. Small rites teach the city to respect parts that seem dull, but hold the whole together. Together they make a pantheon that acts like a toolkit, with large hammers and fine screwdrivers, each in a labeled slot, each picked up when the moment calls. So, we keep walking. The big names fade into the hum of the crowd. The work shifts to corners and thresholds. If you listen, you can hear a hinge click, a cart roll, a stream rush below the street. Each sound has a keeper with a name and a day on the clock. Let's walk through the city and meet the small powers in every tool and street. Why bless a door hinge? Because in a city that runs on ritual, the smallest moving part can carry the weight of peace. A hinge keeps strangers out and warmth in. If it fails, trouble slips through. Romans looked at that risk and gave the hinge a name, a rite, and a keeper. Cardia holds the hinge. Terminus guards the border. Cloacina watches the sewer. These are not nicknames, they are jobs. Each power focuses on a function the city needs every day. The hinge turns clean, the stone stays put. The drain clears the street after rain. When you walk through Rome, you move through an alphabet of duties made sacred to us. That can sound like too much reverence for hardware. To them, it was common sense. A broken hinge invites theft. A shifted marker starts a feud. A clogged sewer spreads sickness. So you speak to each task with a rite that says, "Do your work, and we will do ours." That contract keeps people honest and systems steady. What this means is simple. When you name a force, you can assign a rite. When you assign a rite, you create accountability. If the hinge groans, someone knows the prayer, the oil, and the day to tend it. If a boundary is in dispute, there is a God whose dignity forbids tampering. The act moves from whim to protocol. Shrines give this teeth. A small altar by a gate marks the hinge's honor. A stone on a hill wears a wreath on its day. A modest niche near a drain holds fresh offerings after a cleansing run. These are not grand monuments. They are signposts that tell everyone, this piece of the city belongs to a compact. Touch it right or answer for it. The household mirrors the whole. In a corner, the family altar glows. You greet the Lares and Penates, but you also fold in the small forces that keep the place sound. You bless the threshold. You keep the hearth clean. A home that does this on schedule trains people who keep streets and courts on schedule. Private habit makes public order possible. You can feel the loop in the calendar. Festivals set city pace, and some days pull the home into the same current. A Day for Borders includes a simple act at the field's edge. A season for cleansing aligns with sweeping the courtyard and the street. Work stops or shifts, so rights land in both spheres. Domestic care becomes civic duty, not by law alone, but by timing. This approach solves a problem that every big society faces. How do you make 1,000,000 minor acts add up to stability? You spread devotion out. You centralize oversight. Cardia gets her nod, always the same day, always with the same words. Terminus receives his crown at the marker, so neighbors see you honor the line. Cloacina's space is kept neat, so even what runs out of sight feels watched. The system runs on the idea that small failures scale. A loose hinge leads to a breach. A moved stone leads to a border war. A foul channel leads to disease that empties markets. By putting a god on each part, Rome makes care a moral act. You are not just fixing a thing, you are keeping faith. Notice how the acts teach. Children see a ribbon tied near a hinge and learn that doors matter. They stand by a marker in daylight and learn that land is not a toy. They carry a small basket to a shrine by a drain and learn that waste has a path and a place. Ritual becomes a classroom, and the subject is maintenance. There is a quiet elegance to it, no lectures, just steady forms. You can hear the city breathe on those days. A pause at the field's edge, a murmur by the gate, a line of neighbors at a marker with laurel. The rites sink in because they are light on fuss and heavy on rhythm. The lesson stays because it repeats. What this shows is Rome's way of turning functions into sacred duties. The hinge opens to hospitality and closes to harm. The stone tells you where to stop. The sewer carries off what would poison the block. When each has a god, care is not optional. It is a kind of oath that even the busy cannot forget. And yet, all these small powers sit within a larger frame. The calendar that carries their days is set by officials. The funds for shrines and repairs pass through public hands. If a rite goes wrong or a dispute erupts, priests and courts step in. Distributed devotion, central oversight. The aim is a city where many acts feel local but add up to a single order. You can think of it like a grid of little switches, each one tied to a task. Families flick their switches at home. Workers flick theirs on the street. Priests check that the current flows. Above the grid, one high law keeps the system fair. That higher law sits with a sky power whose name you already know. He hears oaths and hates false play. So, who sits at the top, shaping law and fate? The answer is the same voice that makes contracts bite and promises hold. The god of the bright high place ties speech to consequence. Under that gaze, a boundary vow is not just talk. A pledge to keep a drain clear holds weight. A promise made at a door stands firm. Here's the mini payoff. Religion becomes governance you can touch. The city blesses hinges, borders, and drains not to chase charm, but to encode duty into space. You pass from right to right and feel how the law lives in things. A central authority backs it, so the many small devotions do not sprawl. They align, now we lift our eyes from corners and stones to the big circle, those major powers who act as the city's front row. They hold the posts that shape time, marriage, grain, trade, sea, fire, and the hearth that never goes out. Let's meet the Dii Consentes and the selected powers of the state. If the roster keeps growing, who are the starters? Rome answered with a front row. The Dii Consentes stand as 12 headline gods, and around them sits a wider bench called the Dii Selecti. Think of them as the canonical core, the set you can count on when the city needs to speak with one voice. They echo the famous Greek set, but their posts feel different in Roman hands. Roles track law, marriage, supply, muster, and civic time. Story matters, but office defines impact. The same familiar faces show up, yet they clock into jobs that make a city run without slipping. At the top, Jupiter anchors public oath and final say. He is the bright permission that makes laws bite. When words need weight, his name seals them. Juno steps beside him as guardian of bonds, household ties, marriage rules, the terms that let families form and stay recognized. Minerva covers craft and counsel. She brings skill to the shop and reason to debate, pushing work and policy toward clean lines. Mars shows up as disciplined force. The point is not rage, but musters, ranks, and controlled power. He stands with spring campaigns and the order that keeps a line from breaking. Venus adds lineage and civic charm. She is favor made public, the grace that helps a city attract allies, calm crowds, and claim a past that looks like a promise. What this means comes into focus on the hilltops, where temples shape how people move and meet. Big sanctuaries serve as civic hubs. You approach them to settle pledges, mark victories, or reset after a storm. Rites done there press policy into time. A decision gains a stage and a rhythm, so it feels shared rather than private. Around this pillar set, more powers hold key posts. Neptune steadies sea lanes and harbors, the breathing space of trade. Ceres governs grain, and the expectation that stocks stay stable through lean months. Apollo lends clarity, healing, music, sanctioned insight that leaders can cite when they need a read on risk. Diana stands for wild borders and clean hunts, a check on excess, and a blessing on measured take. Mercury oils exchange. Markets trust his road sense and fair dealing. Vulcan manages fire in its two moods, danger contained and craft sharpened. He reminds the city to build strong and to watch for sparks. Vesta keeps the hearth, both at home and scaled up to the civic flame. Her presence says continuity, an ember that outlives any single voice. You can feel how this core turns myth into infrastructure. Each god links to a service the city cannot skip. Grain without a schedule is luck. Grain under Ceres becomes policy. Oaths made without a witness are noise. Oaths that call on Jupiter become law. The pantheon works like an office chart that crowds already know, each post defined by recurring acts that train memory. Public cults do the daily work. Priests wear roles with strict duties. Calendars list the days that bring each god to the front. Funds ensure the lights stay on and the staff show up. When a rite repeats on time, it keeps the relationship alive and lowers the chance that someone cuts corners. Regularity is the point. It lets people plan and trust. For example, a feast tied to harvest takes offerings from fields and returns them as a promise of protection for next season. A procession that touches courts and markets binds sacred care to civic places where tempers flare. A vow renewed in a bright hall gives cover to contracts written quietly in the back room. The rhythm turns belief into shared habit. Across this set, you hear Greek echoes, but filtered through order and duty. The Roman versions talk less about feuds and more about functions. Even love turns into policy when lineage and favor shape alliance. Even war looks like a calendar entry with rules about start and stop, muster and release. The stories give faces. The offices give teeth. Temples are more than stone. They act as venues that guide behavior. Steps and thresholds set the tone for how to ask and how to answer. In those spaces, the city rehearses itself. People learn to line up, to keep quiet until the signal, to speak when called. The gods receive honor, and the crowd gets training in being a public state. Support keeps the machine smooth. Priesthoods receive mandates. Repairs are logged. Animals and incense get budget lines. If a rite falters, the book says how to fix it. That safety net makes devotion practical. It also keeps the meaning stable enough to carry from one generation to the next without heavy debate about theory. When this core acts together, it reads like a charter. Jupiter's oath power protects promises. Juno frames family law. Minerva guards craft, and Council Mars maintains clear force. Venus softens and binds. Neptune secures roots. Ceres feeds. Apollo clarifies. Diana balances the take from land, and wood. Mercury clears exchange. Vulcan disciplines fire. Vesta keeps the pilot light on. The list feels complete not because it covers every niche, but because it maps the main levers of a working city. On the other hand, the roster can flex without breaking. New needs find room in the calendar, and smaller posts handle detail. but the core set stands as a reference. When a crisis breaks, leaders know which doors to open first, which altar to visit, which words to say. It saves time when time hurts. What this shows is a quiet strategy. Rome reframed familiar gods into civil offices. The move is simple and strong. Take the faces people know, assign them to posts the city must hold, and then ritualize the handoff so nothing drops. It feels traditional, yet it behaves like administration. The result is a pantheon that looks like a cabinet. You can trace a policy back to a rite, and a rite back to a god whose temper maps onto a civic need. It's tidy, it's teachable, and it scales as the city grows from hill town to capital. Now a new layer rises. The map stretches across seas, and loyalty must bridge distance. The question turns from gates and grain to faces on coins and altars in far squares. If you want unity from one edge to another, which figure can hold it? Here's the mini payoff. By mapping Greek shapes onto Roman order, the state turned myth into a matrix of offices. That choice brought stability, speed, and a shared sense of what matters when it made worship legible to law and law legible to worship. Now watch the state bind loyalty across the empire with a new kind of divinity. How do you turn a person into a public utility of faith? You give him a timetable, rites, and a place in the clock. The Imperial Cult did that. It treated an emperor's image as a node where law, loyalty, and sacred time connect. So people far from the capital could act as one body with the center. The setup runs in two stages. After death, the state could raise a ruler to divine rank through apotheosis. In life, honors framed his standing, not just as a man, but as a focus for vows and festivals that stitched provinces to Rome. Think of it like adding a high-profile service to the city's ritual grid. Switch it on, and distant towns pulse to the same beat. Is this worship or a loyalty oath? For subjects, it is both. A salute at an altar also reads as a pledge to the order that the emperor embodies. The gesture serves two audiences at once: the heavens that hear formal vows and the officials who read signs of unity. How did the rite work? A public body declared the honor. Omens might be consulted, a vote recorded, and a funeral staged with signals that claim divine favor. A flame at the pyre, a sign in the sky, a proclamation in formal words. Each step wrapped power in the language of rite. The dead ruler gained a temple and a priesthood. The living court gained proof that its line stood under sanctioned temple building, turned politics into stone. When a city raised a shrine to a deified ruler, it carved its place inside Rome's moral map. The site set routes for processions, the steps staged vows at set anniversaries. Gifts flowed from local budgets, and the calendar loaded with dates that towns could not ignore. Memory became a schedule. What this means is that the Imperial Cult offered a shared script across regions that did not share daily life. In the same month and on linked days, crowds gathered in plazas from one shore to another. They stood, spoke, and sacrificed in a pattern that made distant neighbors feel present to each other. The calendar made a network out of space. The unity did not depend on belief alone. It used habit. Officials posted notices that named the days. Markets paused according to those notices. Priests trained to repeat forms so that the act in a harbor town felt like the act in a mountain city. If you listened, you heard the same words with slight local color, like a chorus with many voices but one tune. Now consider the incentives. Local elites who hosted these rites gained status and leverage. They paid for halls and statues, presided at festivals, and stood beside magistrates while the crowd watched. That role let them claim closeness to power without leaving home. It also gave them a clean channel to show loyalty upward and generosity downward. For their cities, the benefits were tangible. A fine temple drew traders. A new festival brought visitors and coin. A public calendar with imperial days tied local time to imperial time, which smoothed the work of courts and contracts people could plan around shared breaks and shared vows. Order thickened through repetition. At the center and the provinces, practice could differ. In Rome, honors had to fit stern rules, with careful lines between the living ruler's dignity and the divine status granted after death. In distant towns, cult life could lean more exuberant, with processions, local styles, and small tweaks that gave the rite a home flavor while keeping the structure intact. The spine stayed Roman. The limbs learned the local dance. On the other hand, lines had to hold. If a city stretched the rite past what law allowed, correction followed. The state guarded the balance between honor and excess, between living power and divine office. The aim was a stable symbol, not a whirlwind. Too much zeal could look like unrest. Too little looked like insult. Procedure kept both in check. The imperial cult also solved a practical problem. As the empire grew, old city gods had a hard time binding strangers together. A deified ruler's cult provided a portable focus that any province could host without erasing its own deities. It did not replace the local pantheon. It sat above it like a common seal. People could honor their town's guardians and still mark imperial days without confusion. You can think of the emperor's divinity as a bridge toll. To cross from local to imperial business, you paid respect at set points. That act did not drain daily piety. It aligned it. A vow for a harvest could link to a vow for the ruler's well-being. A prayer for safe travel could tie to a salute at a milestone that bore the imperial mark, small acts stacked into a sense of shared fate. Festivals made the feeling concrete. A date tied to the ruler's honor rolled around, and you knew what streets would fill, which songs would rise, and where the officials would stand. Bakers knew to prepare. Traders timed shipments. Teams swept plazas and hung wreaths. Repetition taught the body when to gather and the tongue what to say. What this shows is a fusion of loyalty and liturgy. A person became a public utility of faith by moving into the calendar, the street plan, and the ceremony book. The image on a coin matched the statue in the square and the words on the board outside a temple. That web stabilized allegiance without a speech. There is a cost to that elegance. The model relies on flexibility. It assumes you can add another honored figure without forcing a choice, but a new force rises that does not accept layers. It asks for a single allegiance that does not blend. Now the question lands hard. Can a system built on consent and addition absorb a faith that forbids the mix? Before we face that, hold the mini payoff. Why did emperors become gods? Because it fused loyalty, law, and sacred time into one public act. When you saluted the ruler's divine honor, you affirmed order, accepted the calendar, and renewed your tie to the state. Simple forms did heavy work. The final layer arrives next, not as a new file, but as a new operating system. It will test every hinge and every clause in the constitution of rights we've been following. What happens to a patchwork religion when one update says, "No more patches"? The old grid ran on add and blend. A new command arrives that asks for one God, one flock, one table, the codebase locks. Now the center of worship shifts. Temple ritual yields to congregations that gather in shared rooms, listen, sing, and take part in rites that point to a single source. The mood changes from scheduling many offices to pledging heart and habit, to one lord. Exclusivity replaces the previous habit of layering. Where Rome once welcomed new cults by assigning dates and duties, the new faith teaches that truth stands alone and cannot share an altar. For a while, both styles live side by side. Public sacrifices continue. Mystery cults still light lamps underground, but pressures mount. Leaders begin to favor the new way with grants, permissions, and, step by step, legal weight. In that climate, the onion that loved to grow new rings finds no more room. You can feel the hinge tighten. Options narrow. Temples lose their scripts. A building that once staged sacrifices turns into a meeting house or a store of grain. Stone stays, meaning moves. Festivals keep the day on the calendar, but the story attached to the day changes. A date that once saluted a goddess becomes a time to honor a saint or a virtue. Myths do not vanish. They turn into memory and art. Statues become patterns for painters. Old scenes feed mosaics, poems, and the teaching of style. What this means is not only belief, it is practical management. The old system strains under its own scale. Proper rites cost time, animals, and a trained staff. As revenue shifts and priorities change, upkeep stumbles. Political winds also blow. A new network of leaders finds unity in a single creed that promises one law under one god. That pitch solves problems that a layered pantheon cannot, at least in the eyes of those who rule. Add the moral appeal of a community that cares for widows, sick, and poor with clear rules and steady aid, and the map of loyalty redraws. On the ground, you see reuse everywhere. A fountain once set for a river, God now marks a place to bless water for baptism. A colonnade that framed a triumph route guides processions that carry books and candles. The city keeps its bones. The flesh grows new. The calendar still calls the months by old names, and the week's rhythm takes on a fresh anchor. You walk the same streets, but the signs tell a different story. The onion doesn't vanish, it fossilizes. Layers harden into architecture. Words linger in language. Stories slide into schoolrooms and craft guilds. A door frame still bears a carved vine. A cornice still shows a chariot chase. Children learn those images not as calls to prayer, but as patterns of beauty, as symbols that point to general virtues, courage, temperance, good order. The sacred aura thins and returns as culture. Across centuries, makers reach back to the old stories for allegory. A sculptor repeats a pose that once showed a god and now shows a virtue. A poet borrows a mythic scene to explain human choice. The reuse is not coy. It is a toolbox in open view. The past lends motifs that speak across divides, even when faith has changed. The effect is a bridge. Modern minds learn discipline of form by copying an image that once carried worship. On the other hand, the break had a logic you can test. The old system needed constant addition to stay useful. That habit could look like drift to people who wanted firm borders for truth. The new faith offered a single axis. One God, one revealed story, one path to reconcile the soul. That clarity pairs well with imperial reach. A uniform creed travels, prints law on hearts, and pulls local customs into a shared core. Without endless negotiation of additions, policy backed the shift. When rulers place the new creed inside the state's own symbols, the change picks up speed. Funds flow toward new houses of worship. Public posts favor people who can speak the new language of unity. The social network grows through shared meals, care circles, and a code that tells members how to live daily life with purpose from waking to sleep. That network does what the calendar used to do. It teaches rhythm and creates trust you can rely on. Temples become libraries, or halls of rule altars become tables for bread and cup. The language of sacrifice turns into words about service and memory. Street festivals learn new songs. The noise is similar. The center is new. People who grew up with a million small rites learn weekly habits that strip the clutter and ask for clear choices. Yet the city keeps echoes. You hear them when a month's name rolls off your tongue. You see them when a statue's fold of cloth sits just so. You trace them when a parade takes a curve that was set by an old procession. The fossil is not dead weight. It is a guide to how humans live in dense places. It shows that order loves ritual, and ritual needs places that welcome repetition. What this shows is a trade. The open catalog of gods gives way to an exclusive creed that does not share space. The shift meets the strain of maintenance with a simpler center. It pairs that center with the power of officials who can make policy match prayer. It also rides on the pull of a moral story that teaches mercy, restraint, and hope beyond luck. If you love myths, there is one more twist. The old pantheon survives not as rivals, but as images that teach by analogy. A writer can call on a huntress to speak about wilderness without asking anyone to build an altar. A painter can set a sea god in the corner to stand for risk. The faces live, but as symbols. The city carries them as a memory palace. So, what do we carry forward from Rome's managed gods? We keep the lesson that structure matters, that calendars steer hearts as much as minds, that architecture teaches posture. We learn that rites, big or small, can turn strangers into a public. And we see that systems end not when they fail at once, but when a new network offers a cleaner way to bind people day by day. Here's the mini payoff. Collapse came when an adaptive system met an exclusive creed, backed by policy and a strong social web. The old model could not add that without losing its shape. The new one promised unity, focus, and care that reached beyond city lines. It won the schedule. It won the street. One last thought sits on the edge of the map. When you write, play, or world build, ask how your rites run time and how your symbols train the crowd without speeches. Then try building a system that can live in brick and habit, not only in lore. Roman myth isn't a fixed tale. It's a toolkit, rites and gods arranged to keep a crowded city steady. What this means for us is simple. Stories carry systems. Look for the calendar hiding inside the legend. When you build worlds or read the old stories, ask which rites do the quiet work of order, who keeps time, which thresholds matter, where does a vow become law? Think of ritual as civic software. It runs in the background and sets the pace. Try weaving this motif into your next story and tell me what you discover. What changes when your world's faith also manages the street?